Start. Good morning. If you are here to go to the Bible Times class, you're in the right place. If you're not here to go to the Bible Times class, you're in the wrong place. But we're still glad you're here. So, we are going to go ahead and get started. First, a little bit of recap of recovery from last week. Somebody asked about what I meant by Palestine when I was talking about the Roman map of the world. And I mentioned Syria and that kind of thing. Well, here is the geography that we're actually talking about, okay? I'm going to show it to you in two different maps, okay? First, if you look, I'm going to use the right screen over here. Here is Roman Syria. It's a province. Then you have Coel Syria underneath, and underneath that you have Palestine. Now, Jesus' ministry took place in Roman Palestine, which here's an overview of it, right? But because that's just too small to read everything, this is Galilee. This is Samaria. This is Judea. Down here is Idumea, where Herod the Great was from. We'll take a closer look. Here's Galilee. Roman Phoenicia is here. The Decapolis just kind of runs down the other side. And then beneath Galilee, again, you have Samaria and you have Judea, where Jerusalem is. So, this is what I mean by Palestine in the context of the New Testament period, just so that is clear. Now, another thing that I mentioned was that I had failed to put up for you the early Christian understanding after John's death, that John had ended up in Ephesus. I've given you a few here that are from the next couple generations. Ignatius, born around AD 40, died around 107, about 7 years after John. Then again to the church in Ephesus, founded by Paul, and having John remaining among them permanently until the times of Trajan, is a true witness of the tradition of the apostles. Irenaeus, born around 135, may I attain to this so that I may be found in the lot of the Christians of Ephesus, who have always had intercourse with the apostles by the power of Jesus Christ, and that means like fellowship agreement with Paul and John and Timothy, the most faithful. And then Clement of Alexandria, born about 165. For when on the tyrant's death, we'll talk about him, he returned to Ephesus from the Isle of Patmos. And then Hippolytus, born around 170. John, again in Asia, was banished by Domitian, the king, to the Isle of Patmos, and we'll talk about that, in which he also wrote his gospel and saw the apocalyptic vision. Hippolytus I disagree with Hippolytus' memory, but it's just not certain that the gospel was also written while John was on Patmos. And in Trajan's time, he could have. In Trajan's time, he fell asleep at Ephesus, where his remains were sought for, but could not be found. So, there you go. Now, AD 70 to 100 is our window this morning. And I mentioned last week that the best option for dating 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John is to consider whether John wrote them before or after his memoirs of Jesus' life. Let's start with 1st John, although we won't be able to just stick there long. There are some places where it seems to refer to the content of the 4th gospel, where 1st John does. If you consider the gospel's 13th chapter, verses 34 through 40 through verses there on the screen. A new commandment I give to you, that you should love each other, even as I have loved you, so also should you love each other. By this all will know that you're my disciples, if you have love between each other. This teaching of Jesus among the Gospels, not among the apostles, but among the 4 big records that they produced, this teaching is unique to the record of John. Now, 1 John mentions this where I lost my place in my notes here. 1 John, I'm going to read you 1 John chapter 2, verses 7 through 8. 1 John chapter 2, verses 7 through 8. I'll just have to do the English one because I forgot to make my slide and translate it. But here you go. Dear friends, I'm not writing you a new commandment to you, but an old commandment which you have heard from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you have already heard. So in 1 John 2, this seems to be a direct reference to this moment, which is specified as no longer being new, and this old commandment is found in the word which you have heard. It seems plausible that those people to whom John wrote 1 John had heard that word by reading the fourth gospel, right? Having read it is why it is not a new commandment. Now, John made the same appeal in 2 John verse 5 in almost the exact same structure. And in 1 John chapter 4 verse 2 and 2 John verse 7, both refer to a teaching going around that at the time that John describes as deceitful. Namely that Jesus as the Christ didn't actually come in the flesh, is the phrase used in 1 and 2 John. That Jesus wasn't what we might describe today as a real flesh and blood person like us. What these deceitful teachers were saying was the exact point of the Gospel's 14th verse, right? And the Word became flesh and pitched his tent. The Greek verb is tented. Most of the time it's just translated, he dwelt with us or something. But he pitched his tent among us, and we saw his glory. Glory as only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So John was vehemently offended by the idea that Jesus Christ had not actually come and shared the human experience. 1 John even starts, that which we have seen and we have touched, right? We are witnesses to these things. It's even possible that the Gospel of John itself is the first response, the big initial literary response that John made against this teaching going around, that Jesus hadn't been human like you or I. That was deeply disturbing to him. And he wrote against it multiple times, but it seems like the gospel lays that groundwork first and not the letters, right? So the gospel seems to have preeminent claim to this impression of Jesus. So it seems like 1 and 2 John may have come after and leaned on an explanation of Jesus provided by John's gospel memoir. And 3 John verse 9 likewise mentions a previously received document rejected by a member of the congregation named Diotrephes. He is a big problem. He's the big problem in the paragraph that is 3 John. This would either have to be a lost document or one of the other writings that we've already mentioned, 1 John, 2 John, or the Gospel. We don't know which Diotrephes didn't like. So I also argued that last week that while the Gospel was obviously designed to persuade outsiders in concert with John's personal ministry in Rome and Western Asia, the three short letters from him seem to be responses to issues specific to people who were already believers. And if the letters followed the gospel, the original recipients of these letters were very probably Roman Asian, right? So what was the state of the church that needed these letters in Roman Asia? And I forgot one of the points, which is why that's up there. The phrase, Jesus idea of blood and water is also found in the Gospel of John and 1 John. But we have to move on. I'm so sorry. We have so much to do. I argued, blah, blah, blah. I just read those words. It is generally recommended by researchers. If we're starting to think about what was the state of the church that needed 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John in Roman Asia, that even by the time Paul had written his letter to the Ephesians years before John's Asian ministry, there was already a network of congregations in the greater Ephesus area. House churches, which existed by necessity as belief and human error caused breaches with the local synagogue and the pagan temples, could only accommodate so many people per house, right? One of the terraced villas off of the main street in Ephesus proper might have comfortably accommodated a meeting of, or 30 of so. This is residential unit 2 in Ephesus. That has not been reconstructed. It's just been very well restored. This is residential unit 3. And here is a virtual reconstruction of that space, almost from the same camera angle. So a place like this, in the little public portions of the house, where you would want visitors, maybe 30 people, right? But attempts to reconstruct the first century population of Ephesus alone before AD 70 have floated around 250,000 people. 250,000 people in Ephesus alone. In Paul's day, if we imagine that the good news of Jesus Christ only received modest acceptance, let's say 0.5%, that would be over 1,200 Jesus believers between the Jews and Gentiles of Ephesus in that city by itself. So, multiple house churches probably, and personally I cannot begin to account for the whole size of the church in the rest of the province during John's later ministry. And here is, I have a little map for you because so many of the 7 churches of Revelation were in Lydia. Here is Ephesus here, then Laodicea, Philadelphia, Thyatira, Pergamon, Smyrna, and I'm missing one, Sardis. There we go. So look at all, it's not like there were just 7 cities. Like there were so many places for the gospel to go. The 7 churches who received the letter of Revelation were probably just the centers of Christianity, or the ones who particularly needed to be told, right? Not necessarily the limit of the Christian community, but which would be far more than 1,200 probably. And within that number, there would be these denominational lines against which John was writing, right? Those who actively denied John's authority, like Diotrephes. Those who were gathering followings and teaching that Jesus hadn't come in the flesh, right? These are not just ideas that don't leave the closet. These were gaining traction, and John was writing against them for a reason. And the people who had gotten too Roman, right? The first century Christians of Roman Asia were many, they were imperfect, and they were in need of John's guidance. And at some point, John caused enough of a ruckus that one of the provincial, I would argue, authorities, for reasons we don't entirely have time to cover today, provincial authorities seem to have shipped him off to Patmos for a while, where there was no Christian community. It was not a desert island. There was a settlement there. They had a temple to, I think they actually had a temple to Apollo. There was a Roman theater that's been excavated there. Like there was a whole town. It wasn't a prison colony per se. They just got him out of Christian space. They got him out of the conversation. Domitian would have probably gladly killed him if he'd been truly directly involved. And I don't think anybody has made a nice looking map of all of the archaeological features of Patmos. The best I could find was one that shows where all the beaches are and where you can get good drinks now. But, and that's over here. But there you go. That's the best I could do. So one thing, so key factors in dating in the dating and occasion of revelation involve when the document was written. And so help me, it is not 1044 right now. Oh, I am so mad. Okay, I'm going to talk real fast. One of these things seems to have been a comparison of Rome to Babylon. This is significant. And I'm now going to leave my manuscript because we just ain't got time. So, it's ad-lib from now on. Buckle up. So, this is a long conversation in the first century, okay? Jews, long before AD 70, were terrified of the potential consequences of Rome getting angry at Judea. Okay? That was always on the board. In fact, somewhere between 4 BC and AD 30, there was a Jewish document written called the Assumption of Moses. And there shall come upon them, that's, the Israelites, a second visitation and wrath. The first being the Babylonians. Okay? There is no reason in biblical history to compare Rome to Babylon outside of its threat to Jerusalem and its potential to relocate Jews into its empire. Okay? Just no other reason to make the comparison. And there shall come upon them a second visitation and wrath, such as not befallen them from the beginning until that time, in which he will stir up against them the king of the kings of the earth, and one that rules with great power, who shall crucify those who confess their circumcision, and those who conceal it he shall torture, and deliver them up to be bound and led into prison, and their wives shall be given to the gods among the Gentiles, and their young sons shall be operated on by the physicians in order to bring forth their foreskin, and others amongst them shall be punished by tortures and fire and sword. And you get the picture. And this was before AD 70. This was what they were afraid of. And then you have 1 Peter 3:15 written pre-70. She in Babylon, that should say 5:13. 3:15 is the, give a defense verse. 1 Peter 5:13, forgive my numerical dyslexia. She in Babylon, also chosen, greets you, and Mark, my son. 1 Peter was written in Rome. And then you've got 4th Ezra, which it's just a whole document. 4th Ezra is a document falsely written under the name of the Old Testament scribe, whose book we do have in the Hebrew Bible. And 4th Ezra was written between AD 95 and 195. And the entire document is about Ezra having this conversation with God about how to navigate the Babylonian exile. Thing is, it was written in the Roman period. You know why? Because this is how they thought about Rome. And then that's after the temple was destroyed. And then in chapters 14 through 18 of Revelation, Babylon is a featured antagonist, right? So this conversation predates AD 70, but it was cemented in AD 70. And its impact on the Jewish world outside of Judea has been argued. People have said that because the diaspora Jews were used to having life, outside of Jerusalem, it wouldn't have been such a big deal if Jerusalem fell. Well, that was not the case in Roman Asia, not for that particular province, maybe for other places, but not for where John had his latter ministry. The Jews, in fact, since 43 BC, the political status of Jerusalem had allowed the Jews originally of Asia, and then everybody, to be exempt from Roman military service. It was the Asian Jews first, and then the empire. the imperial Jews broadly were exempt from Roman military service. And the city of Ephesus in particular, that Jewish community was in charge of gathering the provincial annual 2 drachma tax to pay the Jewish temple and send it off to Jerusalem. And both days of Pentecost that are featured in the book of Acts, there's a party there from Asia. Like, Asian Jews cared about Jerusalem. There's a significant and generational financial and personal investment in Jerusalem. They had a lot to lose in that place. And then, within that, what happens when AD 70 does come around? So, after AD 70, Vespasian made several choices, okay? One was that the Jews had to keep paying the 2 drachma tax. But since the Jerusalem temple is no more, the tax now goes directly into the treasury of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus Capitolinus. They have the tax now goes to pay a different god, support the temple of a pagan deity. And that was called the Fiscus Judaicus, is what the temple tax was rebranded, the Jewish tax, it came to be called in Vespasian's time. And on top of that, he legally undermined any large-scale plan that the dispersed Jews from the revolt would have had to return to Judea by selling the province off pretty much wholesale, piece by piece, to private landowners. He sold Judea, except for Emmaus, where he retired some of his soldiers that had served under him, and some of the countryside he kept for himself. But he sold Judea. And then, on top of that, everything that had been looted from the temple, he put into a new temple for the goddess of peace, for Pax. And so all the treasuries, except for 2 big ones that went to the imperial palace, the veil that was in front of the Holy of Holies, and the copy of the law that was kept in the Jerusalem temple, the law of Moses, everything else went into this pagan temple. And so, and free with your tuition, the massive influx of wealth afforded by Vespasian's campaign probably helped fund a lot of his public investment in Rome, which within 2 years involved the beginning of the Amphitheatrum Flavium, the Flavian Amphitheater, which later came to be known as the Colosseum because it spent like 300 years next to a colossal statue of Nero. That's why it's called the Colosseum. It was a nickname. But it was called the Amphitheatrum Flavium. In any case, free with your tuition. So, after AD 70, it is hard, not in experience, not fear, but experience, it is hard not to see the comparison between Rome and Babylon, who have destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, only 2 parties to destroy the temple in Jewish history, and the only 2 parties to significantly relocate the population of Jerusalem, right? So it's there. And to that, and so the fact is, it can't be that conversation is part of the background, but the conversation is too long to date Revelation, right? Because the conversation was already happening before AD 70 even occurred. Now, a datum point that is often discussed is Revelation 11, 1 through 2. And to read like a staff was given to me, he was saying, you must get up and measure the sanctuary of God and the altar, and they who are worshiping therewith. You must exclude the outer courtyard of the sanctuary. Leave it out. That phrase is really hard for me to translate, and I just didn't have time to look into it. But because it's given to the Gentiles, and they will trample the holy city 40 and 2 months, which is 3.5 years. One, I translated it with a contraction because it's a verbal tense that I don't know whether, and commentators argue over whether it should be it is given to the Gentiles as maybe beforehand, right? Like a decision that God has made that just will come to pass. It is, it's gonna happen. It is given to the Gentiles. It's written off to the Gentiles. Or it was given as if it is already memory. You just can't tell from the Greek text alone, I don't think. And then they will trample the holy city 42 months. Is it possible for this to be written after AD 70 if we have a future tense verb in the Greek text? Well, in short, the answer is yes. If John and the audience understood that this was a reference, probably to Daniel. It is the most notable feature of Revelation that what God did in showing John was obviously and repeatedly creating a tapestry of vision out of the Old Testament literature that was available to them. And it would be no surprise if this was understood as the reference to Daniel that it probably was, if in reception, in provision and reception, the future tense of Daniel was just retained. When we read something and when we're quoting the Old Testament, something will happen and we're quoting an Old Testament verse, we don't actually update the tense of the passage in recitation, right? We don't quote some passage in Exodus saying, or Genesis, I will give you this land. We just quote it and keep the future tense. They very well could have done the same thing. So literarily and in conversation, it's quite possible that this was still written after AD 70. And the fact is there are more datum points that we just don't have time to discuss. But the clearest evidence that Revelation was written after AD 70 is the difference. One is that this had to be a spiritual temple, right? This is a real prediction about something that will happen, but it's about a spiritual temple. In this passage, I keep pointing at the wrong one. In this passage, the sanctuary, the temple proper, isn't destroyed, but that just wasn't true in history. Right? You see these great buildings, not one stone will be left here atop another stone that's not been dislodged. However, the temple in Revelation, where John actually experiences most of the first half of the vision, is probably the temple that he was told to get up and measure. A visionary temple, the heavenly untouched one. And so it's a visionary temple in John 11, not the historical one, because it's just not historically true. And two, there is Irenaeus. So we've already mentioned Irenaeus. He was one of the people I showed you a quote from earlier. Irenaeus was born and spent the better part of the first 20 years of his life in Smyrna, one of the recipient congregations of the book of Revelation. And so he grew up in a community for whom Revelation would have been a particularly significant apostolic document. Revelation was to the church in Smyrna what 1 Corinthians would have been in Corinth, right? It's a big deal. And so he says, for it was seen of the book of Revelation, for it was seen not long ago, but almost in our generation at the end of the reign of Domitian. If, he had just been speaking from way far off in the distance, way later, then sure. He did end up being a bishop in France. He was an elder in Lyon. But he is probably conveying the actual tradition of the Christian community in which he was raised. This is probably not Irenaeus' personal memory. This is Smyrna's understanding of where Revelation came from, very probably. And that was at the end of the reign of Domitian. And Domitian he was the second son of Vespasian after Titus, and he reigned from 81 to 96. And free with your tuition, Domitian, after he was assassinated, was replaced by the Senator Nerva. Nerva who reigned from 96. Nerva would have reigned in such fashion that it was not a problem for John to return from Patmos into his Christian community. Trajan was Nerva's adopted son, and John died while Trajan was emperor. And then by the time Irenaeus is born, Hadrian was emperor. And he was just tidying up the second Jewish revolt when Irenaeus would have been born. Free with your tuition. Yes, sir.
That slide on Irenaeus, what did that mean?
Boop, boop. What?
It was seen.
The book in the rest of the passage is the Revelation. The book of Revelation. The book of Revelation. Some people have tried to argue that away by saying that it was John, but that's not. The book of Revelation is the closest antecedent in the Greek text, and the Latin translation of Irenaeus also supports this reading. So, it is the book of Revelation that was seen not long ago, almost in our generation, at the end of the reign of Domitian. So, he probably got it in the mail around AD 90. He got Revelation sent out around AD 90, which brings us to what was the last decade like? Because remember, Revelation is meant to address for the Asian Christians things that must soon take place, right? So, if he got it in the mail in AD 90, the window of must soon take place should at least include the last decade of the century. It doesn't have to be limited to the last decade of the century. It could have happened, some of the stuff could have, come after John died, but it needs to at least include it in the potential window, right? So, what was it like? Well, one, bad times, okay? Economically speaking, real bad times. I got to get back to my notes here. So, tra-la-la-la-la. Here we go. For one thing, significant environmental and economic distress on the average household. In the imperial Roman economy, Rome came first. It had long been the policy to use Egypt, North Africa, and eastern provinces, including Asia, as the breadbasket for the greater Mediterranean. And when these places suffered drought or high heat or blight or pestilence or famine, etc., it was imperial policy to make sure that people in Rome didn't notice. Right? The people of Rome didn't suffer, and the provinces just had to deal with low supply and high grain prices. On top of that, Rome allowed over time for more and more land to be converted from grain-producing land to vineyards and olive orchards on the properties of elite landowners, essentially cash crops, even as Rome's provincial demands for grain remained, leaving even less for the average household to eat. In AD 92, Domitian actually tried to re-expand the size of provincial grain production. He made a decree, well, really empire-wide grain production, and he made an imperial decree that the size of vineyards and olive orchards had to be shrunk down, and a proportional amount of that land had to start being used for grain again. Domitian did that. The historical circumstances in Western Asia pertaining to this decree could be referenced in Revelation 6:6. A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of wheat, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. And don't damage the olive oil and the wine. You see, in response to Domitian's decree, the landowners of Western Asia lobbied for and achieved an exemption. They did not have to cooperate. They did not have to sacrifice any of their oil or wine property. And so, even as the scarcity was in play, the politics and the politics of Western Asia, well, of the province of Asia as a whole, would have kept scarcity and prices going in the grain market for I don't know how long. So this is an actual possible issue touched on by Revelation. Now, also there is the issue in Revelation of Satan. There is mentioned as a synagogue of Satan, and insofar as Babylon is portrayed in Revelation, one of God's big problem with Babylon is that it had this influence to indecency and disbelief on those who were living within the scope of its power, which is pictured as supported by Satan. Now, the synagogue of Satan that is mentioned in the initial part of the letter probably refers to a synagogue, a Jewish community that was particularly adverse to the gospel, right? But when it comes to the activity of Satan outside of the Jewish rejection of the gospel, when it comes to the satanic support of Babylon, I would just ask you to remember how in 1 Corinthians 10, I believe, Paul told them that if they went and they ate at tables associated with idols, they were really eating at the tables of demons, right? Paul had the understanding that the idols of Corinth were actually underwritten by demons. It should come as no surprise if John's understanding is that the Roman Imperium, the pagan Roman Imperium, as well as other institutions that reject the gospel, are patroned by Satan himself. It's essentially the same thought. It's just Paul says demons and John says Satan. It should come as no surprise, right? But the real difficulty is that I was not able to determine before this class what the status of Jews was after AD 70. And within the first century, there is very little understanding separating by Roman life of Christians and Jews. Christians are seen predominantly as a sect of Judaism, not their own religion. And before AD 70, it was the deal that Jews did not have to worship the emperor. As long as they just made a daily sacrifice to God on behalf of the emperor. I don't know what became of that when the temple is no longer around and sacrifices can no longer be made daily on behalf of the emperor. It seems, I'm inclined to guess that Jews and Christians alike were sucked into this new pressure, a loss of religious political status to engage the victorious emperor worship of the day. And Domitian, we've talked about how Domitian was only the latest in a long line of emperors worshipped in Asia. But and I don't have time for all of this, but here's the Temple of Domitian right there in the heart of Ephesus, and an inscription on it to the Emperor Domitian Caesar Augustus Germanicus during the you get it. But the emperors have long been worshipped, and more so when a Christian, even before AD 70, when a Christian had been kicked, a Jewish believer had been kicked out of the synagogue, it left them exposed to the expectation that they should now worship the emperor, right? So all along, there's this pressure. And then persecution. I'll just say this. There is no evidence of static empire-wide persecution of Christians in the first century or even towards the end of the first century. It just didn't happen. There were pockets of persecution, and what we should really probably envision in Roman Asia is experienced any persecution perceived in Revelation is persecution on the proconsulship level, the local governance level, or even just the community level of rejection of the gospel, right? And the big evidence for that is Pliny the Younger. 20 years after John dies. 20 years after John dies, or John writes Revelation, I don't remember. During the time of the Emperor Trajan, when John died, Pliny the Younger, an expert in Roman law, is one province over from Asia. And he has to ask Trajan, what do I do with these Christians that aren't worshiping you? If the empire had really had a developed habit and tradition and policy of Christian persecution, Pliny would not have had to ask. He just didn't know, because persecution was not a developed enough reality in daily Roman life. So don't overestimate some big empire-wide view of persecution as a tool for dating Revelation. It doesn't work. It's just not there. But persecution on the local and proconsulship level would have, and community level, would certainly have been present, and was present before AD 90. All the apostles had already been killed. The martyrs who are mentioned in Revelation probably included in the Christian mind Peter, Paul, Andrew, Matthew, all of them, as well as Stephen and all the people that you read about suffering in the book of Acts. It's not just there in Roman Asia, even if the focus of Revelation is Roman Asia. Any questions?
So when Peter wrote to the Jews scattered throughout those regions, he's talking about local persecution, not Roman.
Yes. Empire-wide persecution did not exist in the first century. Just didn't happen. There were pockets, like real pockets of it, but not some monolithic thing. Other questions?
What are we looking at next week?
We're moving back in time to 68 backwards. So,
Would there have been, you said that you couldn't nail down anything about the Jews after the temple.
yes.
Would there, that's kind of strange since,
Well, it's not that there's not information. It's that I didn't have time to look it up. I did not have time to dig into what became of Jewish religious political status after the fall of the temple.
and
Yes.
even if they wrote what happened after that, could we believe it, you think?
I mean, you take it with a grain of salt, but yeah, I mean, historical witness is historical witness. So yeah, believe it as much as you believe Josephus. So there you go. Other things? Any other questions? Thank you for your patience. You are dismissed.